My name is Greg Creek and I'm an academic here at RMIT. I've been head of the drawing studio for many years, but also I've worked in some of the other areas like painting and sculpture, and I think each of those sort of experiences in those areas has actually influenced some of my practice over the years as well. When you've been an artist for a longer time, because I'm a mature age artist, your practice has often been about many things. I was trained as a draftsman, I was trained in drawing, so it was my initial undergraduate experience. And then I was sort of self-taught as a painter later. So my practice has worked across both of those areas, both across drawing and painting sort of languages. And sometimes they've been close together and influenced each other, but sometimes they've worked quite separately. And the amendment drawings, the ones that I'm sitting in front of, they come from a time when I was concentrating very much on my drawing practice. My studio practice develops again over time. It's not like I work from a project to a project or from a discrete body of work to a discrete body of work. Often I am doing things that are quite open-ended earlier on, and I let those elements park. I let things sit in the studio and not do anything, and I go off and start other work or continue with other work. And then I return to those elements. So I'm very cautious to keep a lot of the stuff that I do in the studio so I can use it later. When it's made, I don't necessarily know what it might be used for, but later when I'm more sort of focused about what a project is, things can come into it. The amendment drawings, they have developed over quite a long period of time. They initially began just as doodles in a whole series of drawings I was making in the studio. They were called desktop drawings. And those drawings used to be based on, I had studied way back when architecture, and it was always an architect's practice to have clean sheets of paper sitting on their draftsman's boards, and I'd always done that. And so the clean sheets of paper on the draftsman's boards used to then collect doodles and incidental drawings and ideas and stuff. And some of the original circular ringed drawings, which I now call the amendments, first began to appear in those drawings. If you look at some of those drawings, they're actually echoing coffee stains, coffee cup stains that are sitting on the draftsman's board as well. So they began there, and I would work back into them with other colour relationships in those sort of incidental drawings, but they were very small. They were the size of a sort of coffee cup base. And these particular drawings came out as a single body of work when I began to think about scale. Initially, I didn't have a title, they were just going to be works, but when I began to make them at a larger scale, and by then I'd thought about this drip that comes from each of the rings, there was the notion that this drip subtly amended each of the sort of perfect watercolour circles that the work has developed from. So the title comes from there. There was a slight sort of metaphorical element because I was looking at a body of work that I was making around political cartoons, so there was a subtle sort of idea there about maybe a notion of a political amendment or an ideal being subtly spoiled by another element in a work. I mean, there's a degree of control in the drawings, but if we really got close, we might see that there's also a degree of uncontrol or disorder, because it's very hard, as all artists know. You can control your mediums to a certain amount, but there's always elements where that escapes you, and I think that's a lot of what process and art is about. But also, when you're making those watercolour circles, sometimes you just can't help that there are flicks from the brush or mistakes, and they tend to go onto the surface. And again, if we look closely at these, there may be examples of that. So there's always that sort of sense of it can never be perfect. And I'm not sure I was sort of trying for that, but there's always got to be an element where you accept some of the other the sort of mistakes that come in that despoil what could be perfect. But that increasingly became part of the work, and it became sort of conceptualised into this idea of the amendment being part of the process of the drawing. I mean, drawing processes for me are the fundamental place. I've always drawn, I've always done that, I've always done sketchbooks, which have informed whatever I've done. So my drawing practice is often much more process oriented. In contrast, painting conventional, if you like, pictorial painting, because of its verticality, and I often think very much in these terms, because of its verticality, it then structures a different relationship to the viewer. With the vertical image, the viewer is face to face and is sort of entering into that type of relationship. But with the horizontal type of work in drawing, the body of the viewer has a different relationship to how they encounter that work. And indeed, I have a different relationship to how I make it. So the amendment drawings are very particular for that reason. They're some of the only vertical sequences of drawings that I've made, and they sort of capture that rotation. This is how I often think about it, a rotation of 90 degrees between the horizontal and the vertical. The colourist principles come partly from painting. Some of the early 20th century painting and painters, figurative painters, would use a technique that's called striation, and it's linked to early impressionist techniques where colour, overall colour sensations are built up from individual colours placed side by side. And so the amendment drawings do that. There's no sequence where the same colour or hue of a ring is produced and put next to each other. They're always in counterpoint. From a distance, there are sort of some general rhythms across the drawings. It may be from, an outer yellow to an inside orange sort of movement, or a blue to a purple, what have you. But inside, they're built up of multiple side-by-side layering of colours. The colours are not symbolic of anything. They're not, they have no sort of didactic about them. They're poetic. I start the works with a sense of, well, it's really like a mood, to tell you the truth. And if I was going to use a term, it might be about coolness or warmness. And I would relate that as much to a sort of emotional state. But they build up over time, because you've got to remember when they start, the paper's empty, and the first ring is the tiniest dot, the tiniest presence of colour in a big void. So they grow and change over time. And in the drawings, there's maybe about 90 rings. I think they do vary, but there's about 90 to 100. So the first one can start anywhere. So no, not from the centre working out. They actually start just randomly. So if we could somehow, on a microscopic level, go in and forensically look at them, we would see that where the drips fall over the ring, there would be a very strange sort of interweaving at different levels. Because the first drip is way back on the first level of the painting, but the latest drip must by definition fall over already a sort of potentially the 100th ring. These are incredibly meditative to make. Any type of art making that involves a repetitive act of making in the present. It doesn't have a sort of meta voice. I was asked a question about the paintings. Often paintings have a second voice that have this meta voice, this other voice you're talking to yourself about. But these, because they're so process-oriented, you're just in the moment. And in fact, to make them, you need to be in the moment of execution. So the colour sense just then develops. Obviously, you step back, what's the next one? But because of the way they accumulate, you can adjust them, you can amend them. So if you think, let's say I start with a palette of yellow to a type of pink. If you think that that's getting too hot, you can then insert blues and greens and different saturations of colours to adjust that. So the amendment drawings occurred in two bodies. The first sequence were roughly from the 1st to the 10th, and then I revisited the drawings and did another sequence, which I termed the 11th to the 19th or 20th, whatever it became. And when I was in that process of making, I was just focused on them. And then the mood subtly changes, as I think lots of artists do, towards the end, when you think, oh, this is nice. I like being in the present of this. This is a nice thing. Because remember, when the drawing gets finally done, and it does take some time, so you see it generating, but there is a nice sense when it's done and you get to experience it in its completeness, because then you're out of the drawing. You're no longer in the act of making it. You step out of it and you're like the viewer, and then you can sort of be in its presence. And these drawings have very particular presence, which I love. I love looking at them. I've had them at home, just for my own sake. So Each of the drawings has a drip tray, or sometimes I think of that as a receiver. And this is a very particular way of thinking about a work. It came from some of my time in working in sculpture, which was informed from a sort of post-minimalist point of view, where rather than thinking of objects as metaphors, even though the name amendment is a type of metaphor, but it's also a literal reading. And so the idea of having something that would then capture this drip rather than being other to the drawing and just being an offcast. So I really like the idea that it was a receiver, as if one part of the artwork gives something to another part which receives it. And this has a very interesting sort of concept about artworks giving out, giving to other things and then going back. So there's a sort of dynamic or a dialogue within the drawing that actually I think on another level to what we were talking about, sort of sets up part of what the experience of the drawings are. There's like, on one level, they care for each other. What the drip tray or the balsa receiver did was that it stopped energy bleeding out of the work and sort of recycled it back into the drawing. When I first started doing them, when I did the very first one, the very first amendment drawing, it didn't have a tray. And this led to what we were saying, where I thought there was something out of whack here, something out of place, because this stuff was just being littered and lost. And a lot of, like I said earlier, a lot of my processes are about reincorporating what at the moment seems lost to an artwork, but revaluing it at a later stage and bringing it back into your practice. And so that was a really important thing about realising this should be part of the work. One of the things about the tray, which we haven't touched on, but the trays are all subtly different in size. So there is a sense of intentionality. These two I'm not sure, but others, in other drawings, have had two trays or one big long tray. So that always has suggested a sort of preconception about where will the drips fall. Are they always in a thin, concentrated band in the middle, like a trunk, or can they spread out? So there's been subtle variations and sort of experiments in that sense. If we want to talk a little bit about how they're actually made, I mean, it's quite prosaic. It's not a sort of, I mean, all studio actions are pretty ordinary, but I just have a very sort of junky piece of cardboard in which I prick holes, and one has a pin that goes into the centre of the drawing. So if you look into the drawing, there's a centred pin, and each ring of the drawing is made initially with a pencil graphite. So there's a sort of arc in this action of a scale, a sort of bodily scale. Always reminding me of one of my favourite drawings, which is the Jasper Johns drawing called The Diver, where he traces this arc of his two arms in charcoal. So you have this body scale trace. So I do various circles, and then those circles are infilled with watercolour. And so anyone who's done watercolour knows it has very particular characteristics. And the way that you make a clean watercolour mark is by trailing down a head of loaded pigment with water in it. So these drawings actually, the circle's done, and then each half of the ring is made by bringing down each side of the ring to the bottom. And this then is when some of the leaks occur, or I put them in later. So it's very sort of, it's a very exact type of process, essentially a watercolour process about controlling that. But it's made problematic because, as I said earlier, it's on the vertical. And depending on how you control that, it goes, you just want to break away from what you're trying to get it to do. The paper that the work's drawn on is a very particular paper, and I had to import it, and I can't import it anymore. So it's very particular paper that has a certain size and a certain weight. And sometimes it does curl at the bottom, so sometimes those drips come off and want to go elsewhere. So if people want to look closely at the tray, they'll see that sometimes it's flipped onto the front or splayed off to the side. So they're minor things. At the time you're thinking, oh, it's spoiled, but then you realise, well, that's part of the content.